He walked quietly across the lobby with his head bowed low, pushing the janitor's cart as if apologizing for taking up space in a building where space cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. The Callaway Biosciences Tower rose 30 floors above Midtown Manhattan, all steel and glass and ambition, the kind of building where million-dollar decisions happened before 9 in the morning and nobody remembered the name of the man who emptied the trash. Nobody noticed Daniel Holt. That was the point. That was in fact the only thing he had asked for when the Clean Corp manager slid the contract across the desk 6 months ago and said, "Any questions before you sign?" Daniel had looked at the logo on the pen, a little broom inside a circle, and said, "Just one." Nobody notices the janitor, right? The manager had blinked. Daniel had signed. He was 38 years old and looked closer to 50. The silver had come in fast at both temples, not distinguished the way magazines described it, but worn the way metal looks after years of weather. His eyes were dark brown and quiet in the manner of a man who had decided some time ago to stop expecting anything from a day that hadn't happened yet. His uniform was navy blue. The Clean Corp logo on the chest faded at the edges from washing, and his work boots were the same pair he had bought 4 years ago because good boots lasted if you took care of them, and he had learned that from his father before he learned almost anything else. In the side pocket of his supply cart, tucked between a spare roll of paper towels and a bottle of all-purpose cleaner, was a canvas bag that had seen better decades. Inside it, a cold lunchbox, 1 apple, a small notebook with a broken spine, and a cloth pouch tied shut with a piece of kitchen twine. The pouch was the size of a fist. It held everything that mattered to him, which was not the same as everything he owned. Frank Delgado came around the corner from the service elevator pushing his own cart, a man built like someone had stacked bricks and called it a person. 52 years old, gray mustache, the kind of face that had smiled so often the lines around his mouth had given up going back to neutral. "You look like you haven't slept since Wednesday." "Tuesday." Frank raised both eyebrows. "Personal best." That was the thing about Frank. He asked exactly as many questions as were needed, and not one more. Daniel had worked beside him for 6 months, and Frank had never once pushed past the line Daniel kept clearly marked. They moved through the lobby in parallel, the quiet rhythm of 2 men who knew their route the way river water knows its banks. Daniel's eyes caught the internal bulletin board near the security desk, updated overnight. A single line printed in the building's standard sans serif font, Floor 30 East Corridor, restricted access during business hours. Director's request. He stopped reading there. Frank slowed alongside him. "The little girl's back out there." "What little girl?" "CEO's daughter, Sophie. You haven't heard—" Frank glanced around, lowered his voice, not out of gossip but out of something closer to decency. 8 nannies, 9 therapists from places I can't spell. $300,000, Danny. 300,000. You know what I could do with 300,000? I could go back to Clearwater and grow tomatoes for the rest of my life and still have money left over for a boat. Daniel said nothing. Kid doesn't talk, doesn't eat right. Sits in the corner of that glass room they set up for her and stares at the floor like the floor owes her something. Frank shook his head. Father died 4 months ago. Plane went down out of Denver. Kid was 7 years old and standing at the airport waiting for him. Daniel gripped the cart handle and kept walking. Frank looked at him once the way Frank looked when he saw something he wasn't going to say out loud. Then he pushed his cart toward the freight elevator, and the moment passed. The East Corridor on Floor 30 was Daniel's assignment for the first half of the morning. He took the service elevator up alone, the hum of the cables the only sound. And when the doors opened, the air was different up here, cooler and more deliberate, the way air feels when it has been conditioned to project authority. The carpet was thick enough to swallow sound. The walls were all glass Manhattan, visible in every direction, the city laid out below like a circuit board with the power still running. He kept his head down and started on the windows near the conference rooms, the spray bottle and the microfiber cloth working in the even strokes he had long since stopped thinking about. Muscle memory was useful that way. It left the mind free to go wherever it needed to go, and Daniel's mind these days mostly went to Queens, to a small bedroom with photographs taped to the wall, to a face with a missing front tooth that had never grown back in because there had been no more time for teeth to grow. Owen had been 5 years old, and his hair was the color of wheat at the end of July, and his eyes were so blue and clear that strangers in grocery stores used to stop and comment on them, which embarrassed Daniel in a quiet way he never admitted to anyone. Owen thought the comments were hilarious. Owen thought most things were hilarious. He was the kind of child who could find the comedy in a broken shoelace and spend 10 minutes explaining it to you while laughing so hard he could barely finish the sentence. The last night Daniel had told him a bedtime story, Owen had sat up against his pillow with the stuffed dog tucked under one arm, very serious. The way he got when the story was important, and he had listened to the whole thing about the rabbit who couldn't hop, and then he had said, "Dad, I'm never going to give up on my dreams either." And Daniel had laughed and messed up his hair and said, "I know, buddy, I know you won't." He had turned off the light and pulled the door halfway closed and stood in the hallway for a second listening to Owen settle into his blankets, that small rustling sound. And then he had gone to the kitchen to wash the dinner dishes and thought about nothing in particular. He had not known it was the last time. The accident had happened on a Thursday afternoon in October, the leaves coming down on Flatbush Avenue in drifts of orange and yellow, the kind of afternoon that looks like a photograph before anything goes wrong. Sarah had been driving Owen home from school. A truck lost its brakes on the hill and ran the intersection without slowing, and the collision happened in less than a second, which is not enough time for anything. Not enough time to turn the wheel, or say a word, or do a single thing that might have changed what came next. Sarah survived with a concussion and 3 broken ribs and injuries to her right shoulder that would need 2 surgeries over the following year. Owen did not survive. He was at Brooklyn Methodist for 3 hours, which is how long it took for the doctors to do what doctors do when the answer is already settled, and Daniel got the call while he was explaining rhyming words to a room of 4-year-olds, and he walked out of that classroom and down the hall and through the school's front door, and he did not go back. He lost his son on a Thursday. He lost his wife by the following spring, not to death, but to the particular kind of disappearance that grief makes possible when 2 people blame themselves so completely that there is no room left to hold each other. Sarah had left a letter on the kitchen table in April, written in the looping, careful handwriting she used when she was trying to say something true. She wrote that she heard Owen's voice every day and then remembered. She wrote that she was not strong enough. She wrote that she loved him. He had searched for her for 4 months, hospitals and shelters, and her mother's house in Pennsylvania, and every mental health center in 3 boroughs. And at the end of 4 months, he understood that some disappearances are chosen and cannot be undone by searching. He sold the apartment in Prospect Heights. He moved to a 2-room place in Queens where nobody knew his name, and the neighbors minded their own business the way New Yorkers minded their own business when they lived close enough to hear each other through the walls. He worked as a waiter, and then a delivery driver, and then a warehouse loader, and in between he applied to Clean Corp because the manager's job posting had said no experience necessary, which felt honest, and because the work happened in buildings full of people who would never look at him twice, which felt like relief. The thing he never stopped doing through all of it was making the toys. Every night after work he sat under the lamp in the kitchen, the one with the yellowed shade that came with the apartment, and he worked with whatever he had. Old fabric cut into shapes and stitched together with a needle and thread from the dollar store. Wood scraps carved with a pocket knife his father had given him in the 8th grade. Wire bent into frames, buttons collected from coats, headed for the trash yarn wound into small round heads with faces he drew on with a permanent marker. They were clumsy things, uneven and imprecise, the kind of toys that would never be sold in any store. But every stitch was deliberate. Every one of them had taken time that he had chosen to spend this way instead of any other way, and that choosing was the thing that mattered. He did not fully understand why he kept making them. He suspected it was the same reason certain people kept setting a place at the table for someone who was not coming home. Not because they forgot, because they hadn't decided yet to stop. The cloth pouch in his cart held 3 of them right now. A small bear sewn from a piece of an old flannel shirt, a rabbit made from gray felt with one ear longer than the other, and a little wooden car no bigger than his fist with wheels that actually turned. He brought them with him every day without thinking about it much. They were just part of what he carried. By 8:30 the conference rooms were done, and he moved to the east hallway, working his way toward the far end where the light came through the glass at a low angle in the morning and turned the marble floor into something almost warm. He kept his pace even. He did not look into the office with the frosted glass panel on the door, the one with the handwritten card that said, "Sophie's room" in purple marker. But he was aware of it the way you are aware of a sound at the edge of hearing, not quite conscious but present. He had seen the girl twice before this morning. Once 2 weeks ago in the corridor, sitting in a chair with her knees pulled up and a worn cloth doll pressed against her chest hood up on a sweatshirt 2 sizes too large, and once last week on the stairs between floors when he was coming up with a bucket and she was standing on the landing looking out the window at the street below as if she were memorizing something. Both times he had kept his eyes down and kept moving. It was not his business. He had a floor to clean and a cart to push, and no standing in this building beyond the work itself, and the last thing a 7-year-old girl in crisis needed was a stranger with a mop stepping into the picture. On the 39th floor of this building, Margaret Calloway was finishing a phone call she did not want to finish sitting behind a desk that cost more than Daniel's yearly salary in an office that looked out over a city she had helped build into something real. She was 41 years old and had run Callaway Biosciences for 6 years, and before that she had spent 8 years at 2 other firms doing the work that proved she could run something this size. She had negotiated with federal regulators and foreign ministers and people who believed that a woman in this chair was a novelty that would sort itself out if you waited long enough. She had proven all of them wrong in the most effective way available, which was by being undeniably correct about too many things in a row for anyone to sustain the argument. She was wearing a gray suit, and her hair was pulled back the way she wore it on days when she needed everything to stay in place, and her face was doing the thing it did in meetings, composed and attentive and giving nothing away. But the phone call was from the board's scheduling coordinator, which meant what the coordinator actually wanted to say was that Patricia Harmon had asked again about the Q3 meeting Margaret had rescheduled twice, and what Patricia Harmon actually meant was that the board was beginning to wonder whether the personal situation was becoming a professional liability. Margaret ended the call. She set the phone down on the desk with a precision that had nothing to do with gentleness. Then she opened the laptop and pulled up the folders she had not been able to stop returning to since the previous night. The 9th psychological report on Sophie Calloway sat on her screen in a 12-point font that was perfectly clear and utterly useless. Patient displays complete rejection of unfamiliar adults. Severe post-traumatic stress consistent with sudden parental loss. No measurable response to cognitive behavioral approaches. No response to play therapy protocols. Recommends short-term residential evaluation for comprehensive assessment. She had read it through 4 times, and each time it said the same thing in slightly different arrangements of the same insufficient words. Sophie was 7 years old. She had her father's coloring, the dark hazel eyes and the brown hair that went every direction in the morning, and she had Thomas's way of tilting her head when she was thinking about something, that small sideways tilt that meant the gears were turning. She had been, until 4 months ago, the kind of child who filled rooms. Not loud, not demanding, but present in the way that certain people are present, the ones who pay attention to everything and then say the one thing that cuts to the center of whatever was happening. She had made Thomas laugh at dinner in a way that Margaret had never quite managed. She had a joke about a duck and a librarian that she had told 17 times, and it landed differently every time because she adjusted the timing based on the audience. That child was gone. What sat in the glass room down the hall was a version of Sophie that had locked the door from inside and pushed every piece of furniture against it. She screamed when touched. She went silent for hours at a stretch, not asleep, just present in some interior space that had no door Margaret could find. 8 nannies in 4 months, the last of whom had left after 4 days, and written in her exit form simply, "I'm sorry, this is beyond what I can offer." 9 therapists, credentialed and experienced and professionally equipped for exactly this kind of loss, and not one of them had found the frequency Sophie was broadcasting on. Thomas had died at 17 minutes past 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in December. He was a structural engineer who designed bridges and had the engineer's habit of explaining the physics of everyday objects to whoever was nearby, which Sophie had loved and which had given her by age 6 a working vocabulary for load-bearing structures that impressed her teachers and confused her classmates. He had been flying back from a site consultation in Denver, the return leg of a trip he had almost postponed because of a cold that turned out to be nothing. The aircraft lost power in both engines during descent. There were no survivors. Margaret had been at JFK with Sophie standing in the arrivals hall with a cardboard sign Sophie had made that said, "Welcome home, Dad," in letters decorated with small drawings of bridges, and a gate agent had come to her specifically the way gate agents do when there is news that cannot be given in a crowd, and Margaret had understood before the woman opened her mouth. She had kept the sign. She did not know why. It was in the drawer of her bedside table, folded in quarters. She pushed back from the desk and walked down the hall to Sophie's room and stood at the glass panel. Sophie was in the corner, knees to chest, the old cloth doll pressed against her, not looking at anything. The room was warm and well lit, and full of things that were supposed to help: art supplies, a bookshelf, soft furniture, a tablet for movies. Sophie had not opened the art supplies in 3 weeks. Margaret pressed her palm flat against the glass. Sophie didn't move. The thing Margaret could not say to anyone, not to the therapists, or the board, or the grief counselor she saw on Thursday afternoons, was this: she knew exactly why she couldn't reach Sophie. She had known it for 2 months. Sophie didn't need Margaret to solve anything. Sophie needed Margaret to stop trying to solve things and just be there, imperfect and sad and at a loss the way Sophie herself was at a loss. But Margaret had built her entire adult identity on the understanding that being at a loss was a temporary state you moved through as efficiently as possible on the way to a solution, and the part of her that knew Sophie needed something different from that was the part that couldn't override 30 years of habit when she was standing in a room with her grieving daughter and every instinct she had was screaming, "Fix this, find the answer, make it stop." She was failing Sophie in the specific way that her greatest strength had become her greatest limitation. She walked back to her office and called HR. Daniel was on the east hallway at 3 in the afternoon, 20 minutes into his second pass of the day, the mop moving in its wide arc across the marble when he heard the sound. It came from behind the last column at the far end of the corridor, the one that stood at the junction where the hall turned and the light dimmed and there were no cameras mounted on the wall. He had noticed the camera gap his first week the way he noticed all the gaps and corners and blind spots in a building, because that was part of knowing the space you worked in. The sound was small. It was the sound of someone trying very hard not to make any sound, which produces its own specific quality. A compressed, shuddering breath held too long and released too carefully and held again. He knew that sound the way he knew his own name. He set the mop against the wall. He walked toward the column. He did not walk fast or with any particular intention in his body language. He moved the way he moved when he was doing the job, unhurried, purposeful, not announcing himself. When he came around the column, he stopped. Sophie Calloway was sitting on the cold marble floor with her knees pulled tight against her chest and her face pressed into her arms, her whole body curved inward, as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible. The cloth doll was wedged between her knees and her stomach. She was wearing the oversized sweatshirt, again green today, and her hair had come loose from whatever it had been tied in and was falling across her arms. She was shaking. Not cold. Something that went deeper than cold. Daniel stopped 3 steps away. He stood there a moment and then slowly he lowered himself to the floor. Not quickly, not with any drama. He simply moved down until he was sitting on the marble with his back not quite against the column, his knees bent, his hands loose in his lap. The position of someone with nowhere particular to be. He did not speak. 5 seconds. 10. 20. He watched the far wall, which was glass, and showed the city in the afternoon light, the buildings catching the low sun in ways that turned the glass amber and copper. He could hear Sophie's breathing change, not calm exactly, but shift the way breathing shifts when the body registers that something new has entered the equation and hasn't decided yet what to do with it. He reached into the pocket of his shirt. The bear was small, smaller than his fist, made from the sleeve of an old brown flannel shirt he had worn for years before the collar went. He had sewn it the night before without any particular plan, just sitting at the kitchen table, because the alternative was sitting at the kitchen table without anything to do with his hands. The stitching was uneven. One ear was noticeably larger than the other. The button eyes, salvaged from an old coat, were slightly mismatched in size, which gave the bear an expression that was somewhere between curious and quietly sad. He placed it on the floor, not pushed toward her. Placed at the midpoint of the space between them, set down the way you set down a thing that isn't being offered so much as simply made available. Then he settled back and looked at the city through the glass. 1 minute, maybe more. Sophie's head came up. Her eyes were swollen, and her lashes were stuck together in small points from the crying, and she looked at the bear with the expression of someone who has been expecting the world to disappoint them and has just encountered something that doesn't fit that expectation and doesn't know what to do with that information yet. Then she looked at Daniel. He did not smile. He did not nod encouragingly or tilt his head or make any of the soft sounds adults make when they want a child to know they are safe, all of which Sophie had presumably heard from 9 therapists who meant well and had not helped. He just looked at her steady, and even the way the light through the glass was steady, and even not demanding anything from the moment. Her hand moved. Slowly shaking slightly, she reached across the floor and touched the bear's ear with 2 fingers. She pressed it. Then she picked it up and held it against her chest on top of the cloth doll, and the gesture was so complete and so decided that something in Daniel's chest compressed in a way that he had no word for and no plan to examine. She stopped shaking. Not all at once, but gradually, the way water stops moving after the stone has settled. She stopped. She sat there holding the bear with her eyes closed and her chin resting on top of it, and she was quiet in a way that was different from the rigid, locked silence she had been carrying for months. This was a quietness that had come from inside. Something had been given permission. 5 minutes passed. Daniel picked up the mop. He stood without hurrying, without ceremony. He walked back toward the elevator without looking back. The cart's wheels quiet on the marble, and he pressed the button and waited, and rode down to the lobby alone and pushed the cart to the supply room, and stood there for a moment in the fluorescent light with his hands on the cart handle and his eyes on the wall. Then he put the supplies away and went back to work. Margaret had been staring at the same security feed for 40 minutes when she finally picked up the phone. She had been in the middle of reviewing a supply chain audit when the motion alert on the East Corridor camera had shown a figure moving toward the column gap, and instinct had made her switch feeds without thinking. And then she had watched the whole thing from the moment Daniel came around the column to the moment he walked back to the elevator, and she had not moved from her chair in 40 minutes. She called HR. "I need everything on file for the Clean Corp contractor on floor 30. Name is Daniel Holt." The file arrived in her inbox within the hour. She read through it once fast, and then again slow. The education, Brooklyn College Bachelor's in Early Childhood Education, the kind of program you didn't get into on accident. The employment history, 5 years at Little Bright Stars Academy in Carroll Gardens, which she looked up and found was a well-regarded private preschool with a long waiting list and a reputation for keeping teachers long-term. Then the gap. Then Clean Corp. Reason for departure from Little Bright Stars not specified. 2.5 years between the school and Clean Corp with nothing on the official record, which meant he had either done work that wasn't documented or he had stopped working, and neither of those answers came with an explanation. She called the private investigation firm she kept on retainer and gave them the name and asked for a full background report. Comprehensive, not just professional history. Then she sat back and looked at her daughter's room through the glass panel in the wall. Sophie had come out of the corner. She was still on the floor, but she had moved to the center of the room, and she was sitting with the bear and the doll arranged in front of her on the carpet, not playing exactly, but looking at them, considering them. Margaret had not seen Sophie sit in the center of the room in 4 months. Sophie always sat in corners, always with her back to something solid. She didn't know yet what Daniel Holt's full story was. She didn't know yet about Owen or about Sarah or about the years between the school and the cleaning company. She didn't know that the bear in her daughter's hands had been made at a kitchen table in Queens at 11 o'clock the previous night by a man who stitched fabric in the dark the way other people talked in their sleep automatically, because the alternative was to sit there with nothing in his hands and nothing between him and everything he had already lost. What she knew right now, looking at Sophie sitting in the middle of the carpet for the first time in 4 months, was that something had happened in that corridor that none of the credentialed professionals in her Rolodex had managed to make happen. and the person who had made it happen was a man she had walked past twice a week for 2 months without once registering his face. She pressed both hands over her mouth. The tears came before she could organize any response to them, which was not something that happened to her. She sat in her office with 40 floors of Manhattan visible in every direction and let it happen because there was nobody watching and because she didn't have anything left right now to spend on being composed. Frank Delgado caught Daniel at the freight elevator on the way out at 5:15, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, the posture of a man who has decided to say something and is doing the mental math on how to say it. "I heard something went on in the East Corridor." Nothing went on. "Security desk said the CEO's kid was behind the column. You went over there." "I checked on her." Frank was quiet for a moment. The elevator arrived and they both got on. The doors closed. Frank stared at the floor indicator. "She okay?" "She was calmer when I left." "How'd you do that?" "I didn't do anything." Frank looked at him sideways, the kind of look that says, "I've known you long enough to know the difference between nothing and nothing significant." He didn't push. The elevator dropped in silence. At the lobby, Frank held the door and then said, "You eat lunch today. Apple. That's not lunch. It has fiber. Come on, Rosa's got leftover chili in the back." They sat in the corner of the staff break room off the loading dock, Rosa Whitfield setting 2 bowls down without being asked, a woman who had run the building's cafeteria operation for 11 years and had developed over that time an accurate and unsentimental read on the emotional state of every person who passed through her space. She set a hand on Daniel's shoulder briefly as she passed back to the counter. Not a word, just the brief warm pressure of someone who understood without needing the details. Frank ate half his bowl before he said anything. Then, "You ever going to tell me what happened with the job before this one?" "No." "That's fair." Frank scraped the bottom of the bowl. "You know what I figure, though? I figure a man doesn't go from teaching little kids to cleaning floors in a corporate building because things went well." Daniel said nothing. "I'm not asking," Frank said. "I'm just saying, whatever it was, you're still here. That counts for something." Daniel looked at his bowl. He thought about Owen in the Lego castle, the one that leaned and was about to fall and was also a whole kingdom. He thought about the way Owen had said, "I'll build you a castle." "Dad, you deserve it," with total conviction, the way children say things they mean completely without the adult's awareness that the world frequently disagrees with what you deserve. "I had a son," Daniel said. It came out without planning, a statement so plain and so finished that it sat between them like an object on the table. Frank did not react quickly. He set his spoon down. He folded his hands around the bowl. "Had," Frank said. "Yeah." Another silence, longer this time, with weight in it. "How old?" "5." Frank nodded slowly. He did not say, "I'm sorry," which was the right instinct, because "I'm sorry" in that moment would have been a way of closing a door that Frank was smart enough to leave open. He said, "That's a hard kind of hard." "Yeah." "You make those toys for him, the ones I've seen you take out of the bag." Daniel looked up. "I notice things," Frank said simply. "Not trying to pry, just notice." "Started making them when he was born, never stopped." Frank absorbed that. He picked up his spoon again. "You gave one to the kid today, didn't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yeah." Frank nodded as if something had been confirmed that he had already suspected. He finished his chili. He stood up, carried his bowl to the sink, rinsed it. Then he came back and picked up his jacket from the chair. "Same time tomorrow, then," he said, which was his way of saying everything he wasn't going to say directly, and Daniel understood it as such. He rode the subway home to Queens alone in a car that smelled like coffee and damp coats, the train rocking on its rails in the underground dark. Around him, people looked at phones and at nothing. Nobody looked at anybody. He sat in the corner with his hands on his knees and thought about Sophie's hand reaching across the floor, the 2 fingers touching the ear of the bear, the decision in that gesture small and enormous at the same time. In the apartment, he heated water for tea and stood at the kitchen window while it boiled, looking at the lights of the building across the air shaft. Somebody's kitchen, somebody's evening, the ordinary private machinery of a life continuing. Then he took his tea to the small room, Owen's room, which had a bed in it that he never slept in and walls covered in photographs that he never took down, and a desk where he kept the supplies he used for the toys. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the largest photograph, Owen at the beach at Rockaway, wind in his hair, arms out like wings. "Hey, buddy." His voice was low, not quite a whisper. "I met a little girl today. She's in a bad place. Lost her dad, same as you lost." He stopped, started again. Same kind of sudden, no warning. He turned the tea mug in his hands. "I don't know what I'm doing, Owen. I've been telling myself for 6 years I'm not in the business of being near kids anymore because I can't." He breathed. "Because I didn't keep you safe. I couldn't. And every time I see a child, it's like looking at what should still be happening and isn't. You know that. But today when I looked at her," he shook his head once, "I saw you. Not wrong, not confused. I just saw the same thing I used to see in your eyes when something hurt, and you were trying not to let it, and I knew what that needed. Didn't think about it. Just knew." The photograph, the wind, the arms spread wide. "I'm not trying to replace you. I want you to know that. I couldn't if I tried, and I wouldn't if I could. But maybe this is how you stay in the world, through what I still know how to give." He sat there until the tea was cold. Then he got up and went to the kitchen table and took out the needle and thread and a piece of soft green fleece he had been saving from the remains of a blanket, and he began to work the lamp, casting its yellow circle. The apartment quiet around him, the city murmuring beyond the window, and in his hands the green fleece slowly took the shape of something small and imperfect, and made with care, because that was the only way he knew how to make anything, and because the making itself was a way of saying, "I am still here, I am still trying, I have not yet decided to stop." 2 blocks north and 30 floors above street level, Margaret Calloway was at her desk past 10 o'clock, reading a file she had not been prepared to read. The private investigation firm had sent their preliminary findings. She had asked for comprehensive, and they had delivered. She sat in the low light of her office and read about the accident on Flatbush Avenue, about a boy named Owen, who had been 5 years old, about 3 hours in a hospital, and a decision that doctors make when there is no other decision left to make. She read about a wife named Sarah, who had walked out the following spring and left no forwarding address. She read about an apartment sold below market value, about 3 different jobs in 2 years, about a Clean Corp contract signed at the office in Flushing. And then she read the line about the toys. A neighbor interviewed had mentioned it almost as an aside. "He's quiet, sits alone mostly. Sometimes you can hear him at night through the wall, not music or TV. Just this small sound, like someone working with their hands. Once I saw him in the hallway with a little stuffed rabbit he'd made, and I asked about it, and he just said it was something he did." Margaret closed the laptop. She sat for a long time in the dark office with Manhattan all around her, the city so bright from up here that the sky above it was not black, but a deep bruised purple. And she thought about a man on the other side of that city, sitting at a kitchen table making small things with his hands in the small hours of the night. She thought about a bear placed on a cold marble floor without a word. She thought about Sophie in the middle of the carpet for the first time in 4 months, sitting up considering. She picked up her phone. Then she put it down. She was not ready yet for the conversation she now understood she needed to have. She needed to sit with what she knew for a little longer, because what she knew had changed everything, and Margaret Calloway had learned a long time ago that when everything changes, you take a breath before you speak, because you only get one chance to say the next thing right. Across the city, the lamp in the Queen's apartment was still on. The second week began the way the first had ended, with Sophie arriving at the ground floor at 3 in the afternoon as reliably as the clock on the lobby wall. She came down the stairs each time, never the elevator, her hand trailing the railing at a pace that suggested she was giving herself permission to stop and go back at any point, and was choosing step by step not to. By Wednesday she had stopped looking at the stairs. She looked straight ahead, which was progress of the kind that doesn't announce itself. Daniel was always already there, not waiting, working, moving through the space with the cloth and the spray bottle and the bucket, the ordinary equipment of his ordinary job. He did not position himself to be visible to her when she came around the corner from the stairwell door. He did not look up on cue. But he was there, and she knew he would be there. And that knowing was doing something that $300,000 of professional intervention had not managed to do, which was give her a reason to come through a door. Rosa Whitfield had started leaving the hot chocolate without being asked. She brought it out from the back on a small tray, set it on the table nearest the corner where Sophie usually settled, and walked away without a word or a look. Rosa had worked in this building through 4 different executive regimes and 2 complete renovations, and she had developed a precise understanding of which moments needed language and which ones needed to be left alone. This one she left alone. She just kept the milk steamed and the mug warm and the table clear. The building's other staff had organized themselves around the 3 o'clock hour without any discussion or announcement. The maintenance crew timed their hallway work differently. The security guard who usually did a lobby walk at 3:15 had moved it to 3:40. Nobody told them to. They just read the room the way people read rooms when something matters, and they don't want to be the thing that breaks it. Frank Delgado walked through once on a Tuesday moving fast with a bucket and a focused expression. He glanced over at Daniel and Sophie without slowing down and gave Daniel a look that said absolutely nothing, which from Frank communicated volumes. On Thursday of the second week, Daniel was telling the story of the turtle. It had started with a bottle cap he found near the service entrance that morning, the kind with a rubber lining, and he had held it up and said, "There's a whole ocean in here if you look right," and Sophie had looked skeptical in the way that 7-year-olds look skeptical, her nose slightly wrinkled, and then he had started talking and the skepticism had softened. The turtle came from wherever the stories came from. That place he had stopped trying to map, the place that had always produced the narratives Owen loved best, the ones that didn't come from books. There was a turtle, he said, the cap turning between his fingers, who couldn't swim. Every other turtle in the pond could. They made it look easy the way things look easy when you're watching someone who's been doing them their whole life. But this turtle had almost drowned once when it was very small, and the body remembers things that the mind tries to argue it out of. Sophie's chin rested on her knees. She was listening the way she always listened, now completely without interruption, the cloth doll and the handmade bear arranged on the floor in front of her, as if they were also listening. "So what did it do?" Her voice had been returning over these 2 weeks. Not all at once, but incrementally, the way light comes back after an eclipse first, a sliver, then more. Stopped trying to swim, which sounds like giving up but wasn't. It found the bottom of the pond and learned to walk there instead. Learned every rock, every root, every place where the mud went soft. Knew that pond floor better than any of the swimming turtles ever would. But how did it breathe? Found the caves, little hollow places under the roots where air bubbles collected. Learned where they were, learned how long it could stay in each one. It built a whole life around knowing where to go when it needed air. Sophie was quiet for a moment, turning something over. That sounds lonely. Parts of it were, but then it met another turtle who also couldn't swim, and they walked together on the bottom, and the loneliness changed shape. Changed shape how? It was still there, but it wasn't the only thing there anymore. He set the bottle cap on the floor between them. Some things don't go away. They just stop being the whole story. She looked at the cap. "I'm the turtle that can't swim." He looked at her without any performance of sympathy or encouragement, just looked at her the way he would look at something true. "So am I." The silence that followed had the quality of something understood between 2 people who have stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. It lasted until Rosa came by with a second mug, set it beside Daniel's elbow without stopping, and kept walking. Daniel wrapped his hands around it. The words, when they came, were so quiet he almost missed them under the ambient sound of the lobby. "Did you ever have a child?" She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the bear. He went still. Not visibly. Not in any way she could necessarily read, but still inside. The way still happens when something touches a place that doesn't usually get touched. "Why do you ask?" "Because you tell stories the same way my dad did. He'd pick something up, a pen, a leaf, once a broken piece of plastic off the sidewalk, and make something out of it. He always started the same way too, not once upon a time like in books. Just there was a thing, and it had a problem, and here's what it found out. The lobby continued around them, the soft noise of the building's life, the distant elevator chime, the muted conversations from the direction of the cafeteria. Daniel's hands were loose on the mug. "I had a son." She looked up then. "Where is he?" "He's not here anymore. Same as your dad." She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it, the way she took things in that careful interior processing that she must have gotten from Thomas Calloway or from somewhere deep in herself, he didn't know which. She put the bear in her lap. "What was his name?" "Owen. He was 5. He had hair that went every direction and a front tooth that had come out and hadn't grown back in yet." He paused. "He liked stories." "Did he like the ones you make up?" "More than any other kind." Her hand moved across the floor to rest briefly on his, the small warm weight of it, and then it pulled back to the bear. "When you tell stories to me, does Owen hear them?" The question entered him like something physical moving through the center of his chest. He sat with it. He didn't rush an answer because she wasn't asking for a rush. She was asking something real, and she deserved the weight of a real answer. "I think he does," Daniel said finally. "In whatever way that's possible. I think he does." She hugged the bear tighter and put her chin down on top of it. "Then I'll listen extra carefully. For both of us." He didn't trust himself to speak after that, and she seemed to understand that too, the way she understood a great many things that adults credited only to adults. He looked at the far wall. She looked at her bear. The hot chocolate steamed between them, and the city moved outside the glass, enormous and indifferent and entirely unaware of the thing that had just happened in the lobby of one of its towers. For the first time in 6 years, Daniel felt something loosen in his chest that he had stopped believing would ever loosen. Not go away, not resolve. Loosen the way a knot loosens when enough of the tension is relieved, when the load shifts just enough to let the rope breathe. On the floor above the security feed recorded what it always recorded. But Margaret was watching this time, as she had been watching every afternoon, and when she saw Sophie's hand move across the floor to cover Daniel's, she turned her chair to face the window instead. She needed a moment that the camera didn't see. The investigative report had arrived in full 2 days after the preliminary. She had read the complete version on a Sunday morning alone in the apartment. Sophie asleep in the next room, the city below doing its Sunday things. She had read about the teaching career first, 5 years strong performance reviews, mentioned twice in the school's parent newsletter for specific student outcomes. She had read about the accident in the level-toned language the investigators used to convey terrible things, and she had sat with that section for a long time. Then Sarah's departure, the letter, the 4-month search that produced nothing, and then the neighbor's comment which the firm had included at the bottom of a supplementary page almost as an afterthought. "He's quiet mostly. You hear him at night sometimes, not TV, just this small working sound. He made me a little wooden bird once when my kid was sick. Just showed up with it, didn't make a thing of it, left it at the door." She had folded the report and put it in the locked drawer of her desk. On Monday she had called HR about something else, and mentioned almost in passing that she needed a schedule update on the Clean Corp assignments for the coming month, and was the contractor on floor 30 available for an extended placement, because his familiarity with the executive wing was useful from a security continuity standpoint. The HR director had confirmed without any apparent awareness of what was actually being arranged, which was what Margaret needed. She had also, on Sunday night, typed an email to the operations director at Clean Corp requesting a personnel review for the Floor 30 assignment. She had typed it out fully, 3 careful paragraphs about professional protocols and the sensitivity of the executive environment, which were all true and none of which were the actual reason. Her finger had hovered over the send button for approximately 40 seconds. Then Sophie had knocked on the bedroom door and asked if she could come in, and Margaret had said yes, and Sophie had climbed into the bed and put her head on Thomas's pillow and gone back to sleep. And Margaret had sat beside her in the dark and deleted the email without sending it. She had not told anyone about drafting it. She had not told herself a satisfying story about why she had nearly sent it and then hadn't. She knew why. The reason was asleep next to her with her chin tucked down and her small hand curled under her cheek, the first time in weeks Sophie had sought out physical proximity to another person. and Margaret had enough honesty left in her to admit that the timing of that email draft was not something she was proud of. The conversation with Daniel happened on a Friday afternoon, initiated by Margaret, conducted in the East Corridor near the window where the light came through at an angle that made the city look almost pastoral. She had thought about how to begin this for 3 days and had concluded that the only beginning available was the direct one. "Mr. Holt?" He turned from the glass he'd been cleaning. He recognized her immediately. Had to have, though his expression didn't change in the way expressions change when people register authority. He just met her eyes with a steadiness that she would not have predicted from someone who cleaned floors for a living, and then thought immediately that the prediction itself said something unflattering about her. "Mr. Holt, I'm going to be direct with you because I find it works better than the alternative. My daughter has shown more progress in 2 weeks of sitting near you than she did in 4 months of professional therapeutic intervention. I've watched the security footage. I've read your file. I know you have a degree in early childhood education and 5 years of classroom experience, and that you left that career without a documented reason." She paused. "I'd like to know the reason. That's personal." His voice was even, not defensive. "You're interacting with my daughter every day." "I haven't done anything wrong." "I know that." She said it without hesitation because it was true, and she was not in the business of implying things that weren't. "But I need to understand how a man with your background helps Sophie in ways that 9 credentialed professionals couldn't. Not because I'm suspicious, because I want to know what I'm working with." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Because I know what she's feeling. From the inside." She waited. "I lost a child 6 years ago. My son was 5. He said it the way he said everything, without any apparent expectation that it would land a particular way, without the slight upward inflection people use when they want sympathy acknowledged. He said it because she had asked something real, and he gave her something real back. The corridor was very quiet. Margaret had stood in a great many silences over the course of her career and learned to use them strategically, but this one she simply stood in because it asked for that. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it in the plain way nothing managed about it. "It was a long time ago, but the grief doesn't file itself away. It becomes part of how you read things, how you read people." He looked toward the lobby below the direction of the table where Sophie sat. She doesn't need someone to fix what happened. She knows it can't be fixed. She needs someone to sit in it with her without flinching. Most adults can't do that. They get too uncomfortable with the unfixable. Margaret absorbed this in the specific way she absorbed things that were accurate and uncomfortable simultaneously. "And you can do that." "I learned to. Took me years. Didn't want to, but yes." She made herself ask the next thing because it was the thing she actually needed answered. "Would you consider staying on, not in your current capacity, but as someone Sophie can count on being there, as a consistent presence for her?" She watched his face. "I'll compensate you through a formal consulting arrangement, whatever number you name." He shook his head once, a small, decisive movement. "I'm not doing this for money." "Then what for?" He looked past her shoulder at the city, and his expression did something she couldn't fully interpret, not sadness exactly, something more like recognition. "Because it's what Owen would want me to do with what I still know how to give." She nodded. She had enough respect for an answer that true to take it at face value. "One condition," he said. She waited. "Sophie can't know she's a project, can't know I'm there because someone asked me to be. If she asks, the answer is that I want to be there, which will also be true." "Agreed." She put her hand out. He shook it without any of the awkwardness that usually attended handshakes between people of very different standing, the slight deference, the careful calibration. He just shook her hand the way he would shake anyone's hand, and Margaret found she respected him for it. What she didn't tell him was that she had nearly sent the email. She filed that away in the locked drawer alongside the investigative report. Some admissions needed more time before they were ready to be spoken. The board meeting happened on a Monday, called by Patricia Harmon under the standing provision that allowed any senior member to request an emergency session when they believed company welfare was at risk. The room on the 40th floor was cold. The way those rooms were cold, climate-controlled to a temperature that suggested the people in it did not need comfort to function. Harmon presented first, which was her right as the member who had called the session. She was methodical about it. The cot in the Q3 projections, the 3 major contracts still in negotiation limbo while Margaret's attention was divided. 11% drop in share price over the past quarter, attributed in analyst notes to leadership uncertainty, a phrase that appeared in 4 separate reports. Harmon had printed them all. She was good at this, had been good at it for 15 years, had in fact been good at it when Thomas was alive, and could balance Margaret's intensity with his own particular steadiness. Margaret was aware that Harmon had genuinely loved Thomas Calloway in the way you love someone who makes your work environment function better, who absorbs conflict and returns it as resolution. "Eleanor," Harmon said, which was what she called her in board sessions, "we have all extended every consideration available to us. We've covered meetings, rescheduled briefings, managed the public narrative around Thomas's passing with, I think, considerable grace. But the analysts are asking a question that we cannot keep deflecting indefinitely." She set down her papers. "The question is whether this company currently has a CEO who is running it." The room held 8 people. 3 of them were avoiding Margaret's eyes. That was the count that mattered. "I hired Daniel Holt," Margaret said, and the room shifted slightly, the way rooms shift when someone skips the preamble everyone expected, "to provide consistent companionship for my daughter during a period of acute grief. He is a former credentialed educator with 5 years of specialized experience. In 2 weeks he achieved outcomes that 9 clinical professionals could not produce in 4 months. I stand behind that decision and I will continue to stand behind it." She let a beat pass. "The Q3 shortfall is real. I own it. I'll present a recovery plan at Thursday's regular session. The contracts in limbo are each at a stage where another 2 weeks will not cost us the deal, and I have calls scheduled for Wednesday and Friday. The share price concerns me and should concern all of you, but not because I'm distracted. Because the market overreacts to perceived instability at the leadership level, and the correct response to that is demonstrated stability, not a boardroom conversation about whether I'm capable of doing my job." David Park, who sat 2 seats from Harmon and had been Harmon's ally on 2 previous contentious votes, said carefully, "Eleanor, the concern isn't capability. The concern is the optics of the situation with the contractor." "Then let me address the optics." She looked at him not unkindly. "A mother found a way to help her grieving child when every conventional approach failed. The man who helped her is not a lunatic or a predator. He is a person whose own experience of loss makes him uniquely effective in this specific situation. If the world we're operating in has arrived at a place where that story reads as scandal rather than human decency, then perhaps the world needs to have that pointed out to it." Harmon sighed, the sigh of someone who has lived long enough to recognize when an argument has moved to a register she cannot follow it to. "You're acting from your heart, Eleanor. I understand that. But this company is running." Margaret's voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. "I'm running it. I will continue to run it. And I will also find every available means to help my daughter. Because the day I accept that those 2 things are incompatible is the day this company stops being worth running." She looked around the table. "Anyone who disagrees is welcome to call for a vote of confidence. That's the mechanism. Use it or don't, but let's be clear about what we're discussing." Nobody called for the vote. Harmon gathered her papers. Her face was composed in the way that faces are composed when the argument is over, but the position hasn't changed. She was not Margaret New finished. She was waiting. Harmon was very patient when she believed she was right, and she believed she was right about this, and patience in a person like Patricia Harmon was not a neutral force. The Tribune story ran on a Thursday. Daniel found out from Frank, who was reading his phone in the freight elevator, and held the screen up without comment when Daniel stepped on. The headline was large and clear. Margaret had seen it first at 6 in the morning before most of the building's staff had arrived. By 9 o'clock, the building's communications director had forwarded her 7 interview requests. By 10:30, the 2 trending hashtags on the platform Margaret refused to use had each accumulated more than 40,000 posts. The story had details that could only have come from inside. the specific dollar figure for the professional interventions, the characterization of Daniel's departure from teaching as a family tragedy that had not been professionally addressed. The phrasing in the third paragraph sources within Callaway Biosciences confirm which was the kind of phrase that meant someone had made a deliberate choice and then hidden behind anonymity. Margaret's communications director recommended a statement. Her legal counsel recommended nothing public yet. Her personal inclination was to find the source first and everything else second. Daniel said nothing publicly because nobody asked him. He was not a public figure and had no press contact and no publicist and no interest in becoming any of those things. He went to work. He did his route. At 3 o'clock he was at the table in the lobby when Sophie came down the stairs, and he was in the middle of a story about a paper boat that had taught itself to navigate by the shadows of bridges when a voice he didn't recognize said his name from behind. 2 officers, the kind of presence that changes a room's temperature even in a large lobby. Sophie saw them, and her whole body changed the way a child's body changes when it registers uniforms and connects them to the moment a different set of adults arrived at an airport to say something that ended everything. Her hand found his arm. "They'll take you away." "They won't." He kept his voice level the way he kept it when he told her the turtle's story, unhurried and decided. "I promise you I'm not going anywhere." The officers explained to the general area around him, rather than to him specifically, that they had received an anonymous complaint and needed to speak with him as part of a routine inquiry. The taller one used the word routine twice, which was how Daniel knew it wasn't. Margaret came out of the elevator before Daniel could respond. She moved across the lobby the way she moved when she had already decided what was going to happen and was in the process of making it happen. Her legal position was accurate, and she delivered it accurately. Any inquiry involving a Callaway Biosciences employee or contractor on company premises during business hours required either a court order or a prior arrangement with the company's legal team. This was standard corporate protocol. She was not obstructing. She was observing the process. The officers could make an appointment through the proper channel. The taller officer looked at her for a long moment. Then he said they would follow up through the appropriate office, and they left. Sophie was still holding Daniel's arm. She hadn't released it through the whole exchange. Now she looked up at him. "You stayed." "I said I would." She exhaled and leaned slightly against his shoulder, just for a moment, and then straightened up and reached for the paper boat he'd set on the table and said, "You didn't finish the part about the bridges." He picked the story back up where he had left it, and the afternoon resumed, and Rosa brought the hot chocolate without being asked, and the table in the lobby was exactly what it had been before the officers arrived. But Daniel felt the weight of what had just happened settle into his shoulders and stay there, and he knew that the thing coming toward them was not done arriving. That night, Margaret's communications director identified the metadata trail. The email had originated from a device registered to Patricia Harmon's assistant, routed through an anonymizing service that had done a reasonable but not perfect job of covering the path. The director set the report on Margaret's desk at 9 in the evening and stepped back. Margaret read it twice. She set it down and sat for a long time, then put it in the locked drawer where she kept the things she wasn't ready to speak about yet. The conversation with Daniel happened later that same week in the small office she used when she didn't want to be in the executive suite, the one with the older furniture and the view of the street rather than the skyline. He came in looking like a man who had decided something and was not entirely settled about the decision. "I think I should leave," he said. "The situation is getting complicated. I'm causing problems for you and for Sophie, and I don't want that to be the thing she remembers about whatever this is." Margaret looked at him. "Sit down." He sat. "You're not leaving." "I'm not a fighter, Margaret." He used her name for the first time and didn't seem to notice he'd done it. "I don't want to be on the front page. I don't want people digging through my past and finding Owen and turning him into a news story. He deserves better than being a detail in a scandal piece." She let that sit for a moment because it deserved to sit. Then she said, "I have to tell you something." He waited. 3 weeks ago, the night after I read your full investigative report, I drafted an email to your employer to request a reassignment. She kept her eyes on him. "I had questions about whether you were looking for Owen and Sophie. whether that could harm her in ways neither of us might see coming. The silence was particular. He didn't move. I didn't send it. Sophie knocked on my door and came to sleep in my bed, and I deleted it. But I want you to know I drafted it, because I'm asking you to trust me right now, and you should know the full picture of who you're trusting." He was quiet for a long time. The street noise came up from below the ordinary percussion of the city going about its night. "Did you get your answer?" he said finally. "About Owen and Sophie? You gave it to me yourself at the table when you thought I wasn't close enough to hear. You told her you weren't trying to make her into anyone else. You wanted her to be Sophie and have the life Owen didn't get to have." She held his gaze. "That's not someone using a child. That's someone who knows exactly the difference between his grief and hers." He looked at his hands. "I should have been the one to tell you about Owen, not a report." "Yes, but I understand why you didn't. I don't talk about him to people who haven't earned it. I understand that too." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking you to stay. Not because I'm telling you to. Because Sophie woke up this morning and came to breakfast without being called, and she made her own toast, and she asked me what I thought we should do on Saturday. She asked about Saturday Daniel. She's been living entirely inside the day she lost Thomas for 4 months, and this morning she asked about Saturday." He said nothing, but his jaw moved slightly the way it moved when he was holding something. "The pain you carry about Owen," she said carefully, because this was the most precise thing she had tried to say in a long time. "It's not a disqualification. It's your credential. It's the only credential that actually matters here." He was quiet for another long moment. Then, "One condition." She waited. "If I stay, I need you to tell me who leaked the story. Not so I can do anything about it, so I know what we're actually dealing with." She opened the locked drawer. She set the report on the desk and pushed it across to him. He read it. He read it through completely, not fast, taking in every line. When he was finished, he closed the folder and pushed it back. "Patricia Harmon." "Yes." "She believes she's protecting the company." "She does. She's not wrong that there are risks. She's wrong about what's worth protecting." Margaret took the report back and returned it to the drawer. "She's also wrong to think I won't address it." He nodded once. "Then I'll stay." He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "What you said, about Owen being my credential." He didn't look back. "That's the first time anyone's ever said that, in 6 years. She didn't answer because she didn't need to. He walked out, and the door swung closed behind him, and she sat in the quiet office for a long time, aware that she had just told someone the truth about herself in a register she very rarely opened, and that it had not, in the event, broken anything. What it had done instead was make something possible that hadn't been possible before, though she couldn't yet see exactly what shape it would take. The call came on a Thursday night at 10:10. Margaret was still at her desk, working through the Friday briefing materials, when her phone lit up with Maria's name. Maria was the temporary caregiver she had placed in the apartment for evenings while the formal search for a permanent arrangement continued. She answered on the second ring. "Maria." "Mrs. Calloway." The voice was wrong, too high, too thin. "I need you to stay calm." Margaret was already standing. "Tell me." "Sophie was in her room. I went to the kitchen for water, 5 minutes, maybe less. When I came back, she was gone. I've checked the whole apartment. She's not here. Her doll is gone. Her bear." A pause that lasted too long. "Her sketchbook is on the table. She left without it." The phone was in Margaret's hand, and she was already moving toward her jacket and her keys and running the calculation, the one that every parent runs when the equation becomes urgent. Where is she? What does she know? Where would she go? And the sketchbook being on the table meant Sophie had left in a rush, led by feeling rather than plan, which meant she was going somewhere she didn't need directions to because she already knew the way. She called Daniel before she called building security, a choice she made without deliberating it, her thumb finding his name in the contact list she had added 2 weeks ago. He answered on the first ring. "Sophie's gone. Left the apartment. She took her doll and the bear. Her sketchbook is still on the table." The pause was 2 seconds, maybe 3. She could hear him recalibrating. "Is the sketchbook still on the table?" "Yes, Maria said it's on the table." "I know where she is." His voice had shifted, not alarmed, but focused, the specific quality of someone who has just placed a piece that was missing. "Don't call the police yet. Give me 12 minutes. "Daniel." 12 minutes. "I know where she went. Trust me." She had spent 6 weeks building toward the ability to say yes to that sentence, and she said it now. Go. She called security next and started for her car and tried not to think about a 7-year-old girl on nighttime streets, alone with her bear and her doll, and whatever had pulled her out the door without stopping for her sketchbook. The one she drew in every day, the one she would never ordinarily leave behind. The sketchbook mattered because Sophie never went anywhere she planned to stay without the sketchbook. She had left it because she hadn't planned. She had felt something and followed it, which meant she was moving toward something specific, something she could locate without a map, and Daniel had recognized what that something was in the time it took her to say the words "still on the table." Margaret's car pulled into the street, and the city spread ahead of her in its nighttime version, all light and movement and indifference, and she drove toward whatever was coming next with her hands tight on the wheel and her chest doing something she didn't have time to name. The old Callaway building stood 6 blocks south of the tower on a street that the neighborhood had reclassified over the years from commercial to transitional to whatever came after transitional, which was mostly empty storefronts and a laundromat that kept its lights on until midnight and a parking structure that charged by the half hour. The building itself was 11 stories of limestone and steel that Thomas Callaway had leased for the company's first 7 years before the growth made the tower necessary, and it had been standing vacant for 26 months, with a management company maintaining the utilities at minimum and a security service doing weekly walkthroughs that found nothing each time because there was nothing to find. Daniel parked on the cross street and came around the corner at a pace that was fast without being a run, because running communicated panic, and he needed to communicate nothing of the kind. The street light on the corner was working, and the one in front of the building was not, which left the entrance in a band of shadow broken by the ambient glow of the city above. He saw her before he was fully around the corner. Sophie was sitting on the stone steps that led up to the main entrance, the wide, shallow steps that Thomas Callaway had probably climbed 10,000 times in 7 years, and she had her knees pulled up and the bear pressed against her chest and the doll tucked under her arm. The gate across the entrance was locked with a chain and padlock. She had not been able to get inside. She was sitting in front of the gate in the dark with her face turned down and her shoulders curved inward, and she was very small on those very large steps, and the sight of her went through Daniel in a way he didn't try to manage. He climbed the steps and sat down beside her. Not in front of her, not crouching to her level with his hands on her shoulders the way adults did when they wanted a child to look at them. He sat beside her on the step, the way he would sit beside anyone who was somewhere hard, which was next to them, rather than across from them. She knew it was him before she looked up. He didn't know how. Maybe the sound of his specific footstep on stone, maybe some other register of recognition that children develop when they've been paying close attention to someone for weeks. She said his name into the bear's ear before her face came up. "Hey." His voice was the same voice he used for stories, unhurried, with nothing in it that needed anything from her. "I couldn't get in." She said it as if this were the most important fact of the evening, the locked gate, the chain, the padlock, the thing that had been between her and whatever she'd come here to find. "I know. I thought if I could go where he worked." She stopped. Started again because whatever she was trying to say was in a part of language she hadn't fully mapped yet. "There's this thing I do at home sometimes. I sit in his chair in the study, the one that still smells like him a little, and I close my eyes. And for a second it's almost like he's about to walk in." She turned the bear over in her hands. "I thought if I came here where he was every day for all those years it would be stronger." The almost. Daniel sat with that for a moment. He could feel her waiting for him to try to explain it or qualify it or redirect it toward something more manageable, the way every adult in her life had been trying to redirect her toward something more manageable for 4 months, and he had no intention of doing any of that. Did it help, being here? A little. She looked at the locked gate. The outside part, standing where he stood. But I couldn't get to where he actually was. His office was on the 5th floor. He had a window that faced east. A pause. He told me you could see the bridge from it on clear days. Which bridge? He didn't say. Just the bridge. She almost smiled the edge of one. That was a dad thing, like it was obvious which bridge. Daniel looked at the building's facade, the limestone gone gray in the dark, the old company name still faintly visible where they'd removed the lettering and the paint behind it hadn't quite matched. He thought about Thomas Calloway walking up these steps in the early years of something he was building the way you walk when you're building something with the specific energy of a person who knows the work is hard and has decided that's fine. Your dad's not in the building, Sophie. She looked at him. He's not in the chair either. Not really. He chose each word the way he chose each stitch on the toys deliberately because precision here was a form of respect. The almost you feel in those places that's you. That's you remembering him so completely that the memory becomes something you can almost touch. He's in you that thoroughly. Her eyes were filling. She didn't look away from him. When you ask questions the way you do sideways, like you're coming at the thing from an angle to catch it off guard, that's him. When you make room for a whole story before you decide what you think about it, that's him. You're carrying him in the way you move through the world, Sophie, every single day, not as a memory you have to work to keep, as something you already are. The tears came over. She didn't try to stop them. This was what the bear had given her at the beginning, the first permission she didn't have to hold it back anymore, and she hadn't forgotten. "But I want him here," she said, and her voice broke open on the last word in a way that was pure and uncomplicated and entirely unanswerable. "I want him to be actually here. I want to hear his real voice, and I want him to tell me I did good on something, and I want to show him my drawings, and I—" She pressed her face into the bear, and the rest of it came out muffled and ragged and completely true. Daniel put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into it without hesitation, and he held her while she cried, his hand steady on her far shoulder. The city going on around them with its sirens and its traffic, and its total ignorance of the two of them on the stone steps of a locked building in the dark. "I know," he said. "I want Owen here too. Every single day I want him back. I want to hear him tell me about his Lego castle. I want to mess up his hair. I want to hear him say he's going to build me something." He paused. "That doesn't go away. I'm not going to tell you it goes away." She pulled her face up from the bear. Her eyes were red and her face was wet, and she looked at him directly the way she looked when she was about to ask something she'd been thinking about for longer than the conversation. "Then how do you keep going?" He thought about it. He gave it the full weight of consideration that a question like that deserved, asked by a 7-year-old who already understood that there was no easy answer and was asking anyway because she needed to hear whatever the true one was. "You find the places where they're still doing something," he said. "Owen's in the toys I make. Every one. When I put a stitch in wrong and it makes the thing look a little crooked, and I leave it because somehow the crooked one is more itself, that's him. He made everything slightly crooked and entirely better." He looked at the bear in her hands, the mismatched eyes and the uneven ears. "And now he's in what those toys do for other people. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot." Sophie looked at the bear for a long time. Then she looked at him and said, "You're still doing it. You're still going. Most days. That means I can too." It was not a question. She said it the way his son had once said, "I'll never give up on my dreams either," with the complete conviction of a person who has just understood something and has decided that understanding it is enough to act on it. Daniel had to look away for a moment. He looked at the street, the parked cars, the laundromat sign half a block down, still burning white in the dark. "Yeah," he said. "You can." The sound of heels on pavement came from the end of the block, fast and decisive. And then Margaret was there rounding the corner with 2 of the building's security staff behind her and a police officer she had apparently collected somewhere between the tower and here. She stopped when she saw them on the steps. Her hand came up a signal to the people behind her and they stopped. She crossed the distance to the steps alone. She looked at Sophie, taking in the red eyes and the bear and the doll and the fact that Sophie was leaning against Daniel's side in a way that was entirely voluntary. Her chest moved with a breath she had been holding since the phone call. Sophie. Her voice had nothing in it that was CEO, nothing managed or organized. Just her name said by her mother. Sophie straightened up and looked at Margaret, and something passed between them that had not been available 4 months ago or 2 months ago or possibly even 2 weeks ago. Margaret came up the steps and sat down on Sophie's other side on the cold stone in her work clothes and put her arm around her daughter, and Sophie leaned into her the same way she had leaned into Daniel, without deliberation, without the stiffness that had made every previous attempt at contact an exercise in managed failure. "I wanted to find Dad," Sophie said. "I know." Margaret pressed her lips to the top of Sophie's head and stayed there. "I've been trying to find him too, every day." They sat on the steps of the locked building in the dark, the three of them, while the security guards waited at a respectful distance and the police officer found something on the far sidewalk to look at. The city held them in its ordinary indifference, which was a kind of privacy, the best kind available in a city this size. Nobody came. Nobody disturbed it. The night continued around them. After a while, Sophie said, "I don't only have Mom now, I have you too." She said it to the middle distance, to the gate, to the general arrangement of things, and Daniel understood she was not asking. "You have me," he said. Margaret looked at him over Sophie's head. Her eyes were dark and exhausted and entirely open in a way he had not seen from her in all the weeks of careful managing and strategic disclosure. She mouthed something that he read as "thank you," just the shape of it, and he shook his head slightly because gratitude wasn't the right category for what was happening on these steps. This wasn't something he had done for her. This was something that had happened because the three of them had each been carrying the same weight in different containers and had finally ended up in the same place at the same time. He nodded once. She nodded back. Sophie held her bear. The Harmon conversation happened in Margaret's office 2 days later in the late morning, after Margaret had confirmed with the communications director that the metadata trail was clean and complete and would hold up to any scrutiny Harmon cared to apply. She had given Patricia Harmon 2 days not out of uncertainty, but out of a deliberate choice to speak when she was calm rather than when she was angry, because anger was a less precise instrument than clarity, and this conversation required precision. Harmon came in the way she always came into rooms, organized and self-possessed, her reading glasses on their chain against her chest, her folder under her arm. She sat across from Margaret and set the folder down and looked at her with the expression of someone who has already constructed the first 3 moves and is waiting for the board to be set. Margaret set the communications director's report on the desk and pushed it across without preamble. Harmon looked at it. She did not touch it immediately. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they know the content of, recognizing the shape of the thing rather than reading it. "Eleanor," she began. "Patricia." Margaret kept her voice the temperature of the room. "I want to understand something before we discuss next steps. 15 years. You worked alongside Thomas for 15 years. You were at our wedding. You were at Sophie's christening. You sat at my table for Thanksgiving 3 years running after your husband's retirement moved them to Scottsdale." She let that sit. "I want to understand how you arrived at a place where leaking private information about a grieving man's personal history to a tabloid felt like the right instrument." Harmon was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its architecture. "I watched Thomas build this company from a firm with 12 employees and 2 contracts. I watched you build it after him. I watched the 2 of you together build something that works because you complement each other in a specific way, and I am aware every day that that complementary structure no longer exists." She looked at her folded hands. "The decisions you've been making since December have the quality of decisions made without a counterweight. I've seen what that looks like before in organizations this size. I was trying to create a pressure that would function as that counterweight, by using a grieving child's caregiver as the pressure point." Harmon didn't answer immediately. "Daniel Holt lost his son," Margaret said. "He lost his wife to the grief that followed. He has spent 6 years making small toys in a kitchen in Queens and giving them to children he encounters because it's the only way he has found to keep the loss from becoming the entire story of his life. He is not a liability. He is not a news cycle. He is a person who is doing something genuinely good for my daughter, and you put his dead child's name in a newspaper." The silence in the room was absolute. "I didn't know about the child," Harmon said finally. "The contact I used at the Tribune only had the professional history. The rest came from their own research." "That distinction doesn't hold the weight you're putting on it." "No." Harmon looked up. "It doesn't." Margaret let the acknowledgement stand without embellishing it. "You'll resign from the board. I'll accept the resignation quietly, no announcement beyond what's required for regulatory disclosure. You'll retain your equity position. What you've built here is real, and I'm not in the business of erasing contributions because a relationship became adversarial." She paused. "But you're done in the governance structure. We both know it, and I'm not interested in managing the aftermath of another intervention of this kind." Harmon nodded. It was not a defeated nod. It was the nod of a person who has arrived at the end of an argument they were making in good faith and has encountered the limits of that argument. "You're harder than Thomas was." "I know. He was better at the grace notes." Margaret looked at the folder still unopened on the desk. "But he was also the person who taught me that the things worth protecting don't always look the way you expect them to. He learned that from Sophie, actually. She was 3. He came home and told me she'd explained to him that the best thing about a broken toy was that it proved someone had played with it." Harmon looked at her hands. "She's going to be all right." "She is." The resignation arrived by email 71 hours later. Margaret acknowledged it with a brief professional reply, and then closed her laptop and sat for a moment in the quiet office, aware that a thing was over and that the ending of it was neither triumphant nor sad but simply necessary. The closing of a chapter that had needed to close so that the next one could begin properly. The press conference was Margaret's own decision, made without consulting the communications director or legal counsel, which both of them would have advised against, and neither of them could stop. She called it for Thursday morning and gave the wire services 24 hours notice. By the time she stood at the podium, the room held more cameras than chairs. She had not prepared remarks. She had prepared the truth, which was different because prepared remarks are the shape of something and the truth is the thing itself, and she had decided that what this situation required was the thing itself. "My name is Margaret Calloway," she said. And the room quieted in that particular way. Rooms quiet when the person speaking has decided not to perform. 3 months ago, I stood in an arrivals hall at JFK with my 7-year-old daughter waiting for my husband's flight. He wasn't on the plane that landed. He was on the plane that didn't. My daughter saw it happen in the way children see everything, which is completely and without the adult's capacity to immediately begin contextualizing. She understood exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant, and she had no framework for surviving the understanding. The cameras ran. Nobody asked anything yet. They were listening. I did what I do in every professional situation. I identified the best available resources and deployed them. 8 experienced caregivers, 9 clinical specialists in childhood grief and trauma, more than $300,000 in professional services. None of it worked. Not because those professionals weren't skilled, but because what Sophie needed was not skill. It was comprehension. She needed someone who already knew from the inside what she was carrying. She looked out at the room without looking at any single person in it. Daniel Holt is a janitor. He was a preschool teacher before that. He left teaching after his son died in an accident 6 years ago because he couldn't look at classrooms full of children without seeing the child who wasn't in them. He makes toys at night from whatever fabric and wood he has available, and he gives them to children who need something handmade and imperfect and made with care. He placed one of those toys in front of my daughter without a word, and sat beside her, and did not try to fix anything, and she stopped crying for the first time in 3 months. A hand went up. "Mrs. Calloway, aren't you concerned about the lack of professional credentials in someone working with a child who has a clinical diagnosis?" My daughter has made more measurable progress in the 6 weeks since Daniel Holt sat down beside her than she made in 4 months of clinical intervention. That is the credential I'm working with. She held the questioner's gaze. I'll also say this. We live in a world that has decided the most important thing about a person is what the piece of paper above their desk says. Daniel Holt doesn't have a piece of paper for what he does with children who have lost someone. What he has is the bone-level knowledge of what that loss feels like and the very specific understanding of what doesn't help, because everything that doesn't help was tried on him after Owen died, and none of it worked for him either. She paused. If the credential system produced what he produces, I'd be its most enthusiastic advocate. It didn't. He did. The questions continued for 20 minutes. She answered the ones worth answering and redirected the ones that were looking for scandal rather than substance. At the end, a woman from a wire service asked whether she was concerned about what the story meant for the company's public image. "I'm concerned about my daughter learning to want Saturday again," Margaret said. "She asked me last week what we were doing on Saturday. She hadn't thought about a future day in 4 months. That is the metric I'm working with. The other metrics are also my responsibility, and I'm managing them. But if I had to choose and I don't and I won't, and anyone suggesting I do is misunderstanding the nature of this situation, there's no version of that choice where the answer isn't Sophie." She stepped back from the podium. The room broke into its own conversation, and the cameras swung toward each other, and the story became what the story was going to be, which she could not control, and had stopped trying to. The program had been her idea in the same way that most of her best ideas were her ideas, meaning they originated in something Daniel said that she then translated into structure and resources because that was what she was equipped to do. He had said at the table in the lobby one afternoon while Sophie was showing Rosa a drawing she'd done of a turtle with one leg shorter than the others that the thing nobody had done for him after Owen died was just stay. Everyone arrived with tools and frameworks and therapeutic approaches and meals in containers, and everyone eventually left when the tools didn't produce results on their schedule, and what he'd needed was someone with no agenda and no timeline who would simply remain present in the space with him. She had thought about that for a week. Then she had come to him with the proposal. His first response was that he wasn't a program director. She told him the program didn't need a director in any conventional sense. It needed someone who understood what it was for. His second response was that he had no experience running anything organizational. She told him they would figure that out together, and that every meaningful thing she had ever built had started with someone who knew what they were doing, but not how to build the infrastructure around it, and that the infrastructure was the part she could contribute. His third response was that if they were doing this, the name was non-negotiable. Owen's Light opened on the ground floor of the Callaway Biosciences Tower on a Tuesday, 5 weeks after the press conference, in the space that used to be a secondary reception area, which had been cleared and refurnished over 2 weeks with materials that Margaret had specifically selected to feel unlike a clinical space. Thick rugs, warm overhead lighting on dimmers, bookshelves at a child's eye level. On the main wall, a large photograph of a boy with wheat-colored hair and a gap where his front tooth should have been, arms spread wide on a beach, looking like someone who had not yet learned that the world had limits. Below the photograph in plain type on a strip of white wood, sometimes the brightest light comes from the smallest hearts. Frank Delgado showed up on the first day with a coffee and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the photograph on the wall and then at Daniel, and he said, "You did good, Danny," which from Frank was an oration. The first week brought 3 children. A 6-year-old boy whose mother had died of cancer in February, leaving him with a father who loved him completely and had no map for the territory they were in. An 8-year-old girl whose parents had separated and whose home had become 2 homes, neither of which felt like the original thing. A 9-year-old boy who was being bullied at school in the sustained and invisible way that schools struggled to address, the kind that left no marks and produced no incident reports. Daniel sat with them. He didn't have a curriculum or a framework or a set of therapeutic objectives. He had stories and attention and the willingness to stay in whatever the current moment was without trying to accelerate it toward resolution. On the second day, he brought materials and showed them how to make simple things. A folded paper bird, a twisted wire figure, a small animal stitched from felt, and they made things with him. And the making was its own kind of conversation, the kind that happens when hands are busy and the mouth is free to say things it wouldn't say if it were the only thing occupied. Sophie came every day. She had taken on a specific role that nobody had assigned her, which was sitting near whatever new child arrived and saying nothing until the child was ready to hear something, and then saying very simply, "It's okay here. He doesn't fix things. He just stays." And somehow this was more effective than any adult orientation could have been because it came from someone who had been where they were, who was 7 years old, and spoke from inside the experience rather than outside it, and who had learned from Daniel that the most trustworthy thing a person can offer is the truth about what they've actually been through. On a Friday evening, 3 weeks after Owen's light opened, Margaret found Daniel in the empty room after the last child had gone, sitting in one of the low chairs, looking at Owen's photograph on the wall. The city was doing what it did in the late afternoon, the light shifting toward amber and copper, the shadows lengthening, everything taking on the quality of something almost finished but not quite. She sat in the chair across from him and they were quiet for a while, which had become something they did. The comfortable silence of two people who had stopped needing to fill space between them with language. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Any of it?" He thought about it with the deliberateness she had come to recognize as one of his central qualities, the refusal to answer anything important quickly. "I regret that it took losing everything to get here. I don't regret being here." He looked at Owen's face. "I thought for a long time that if I let myself be okay, it meant I'd accepted that Owen was gone and that was fine, and I couldn't accept that. I was wrong about what acceptance is. It's not saying it was fine. It's saying I'm going to keep going anyway and carry him in the going." She looked at the photograph, too. "Thomas would have liked you." "Yeah." He had no patience for people who confused credential with competence. He once fired an engineering consultant with 3 degrees who couldn't explain the load path on a simple span bridge. He said you can learn the vocabulary and still not understand the language. Daniel nodded slowly. "I think Sophie has that from him." "She absolutely does. It's maddening and wonderful in equal measure." She looked at her hands, then back up. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, not considerately." He waited. "What do you want, not for Sophie, not for the program, for yourself? What does the next part of your life look like if you let yourself imagine it?" The question settled in the room, and he sat with it rather than deflecting it, which she had half expected him to do, because deflection was his trained response to anything that positioned him as someone with needs worth considering. "I want to keep doing this," he said, "not as a program, as a way of being in the world. I want to make things with my hands and tell stories and sit with people who are in the worst part of something and not leave before it's time." He paused. "I want the room with the photographs to stop being the saddest room in my apartment. I want to put Owen's picture in more rooms, in places that aren't about grief." He looked at her. "I want to stop being invisible, not noticed necessarily, but not invisible. There's a difference." She held his gaze. "There is. What do you want?" She hadn't expected the question returned. She considered whether to answer the considered version or the true version, and decided that the true version was the one that honored what they'd built. "I want Sophie to grow up knowing that love doesn't end when the person does. That what Thomas gave her is permanently installed, not borrowed. I want her to know that a family isn't a fixed number of people, but a collection of bonds that get made in ways that can't always be predicted or explained." She looked at him directly. "I want her to know you as a permanent feature of her world, not a passage in a difficult chapter." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what I am?" "You're what happens when someone chooses to keep going when there's no obvious reason to, and the choosing turns out to matter to people who needed it to." And she said it plainly, without sentiment. "That's not a passage, that's a foundation." The room held the late light and held them in it, and outside the city continued with its 1,000 indifferent purposes, and none of that touched what was in the room, which was something quiet and earned, and beginning to set like a structure that would hold weight. The dinner was Sophie's idea, which should not have surprised anyone by that point, because most of the important things had been Sophie's idea in the specific sense that she identified what needed to happen before the adults had finished deciding it was possible. She called it a real dinner, as opposed to the ordered-in version that had been the household standard since December, and she had been working on the logistics for 3 days, which Daniel knew because she had asked him on 2 separate afternoons about pasta, specifically about the ratio of salt to water and about whether it mattered which direction you stirred. Questions he had answered with the gravity they were intended to convey. The apartment was smaller than the previous one, a fact Sophie had presented to Daniel on his first visit as an improvement. We got rid of a lot of the empty space. The kitchen was bright with the kind of yellow light that came from bulbs someone had chosen specifically rather than accepted by default, and the table was set with the slightly imprecise care of a 7-year-old who had measured nothing but had understood the assignment. Sophie opened the door before he had finished knocking, which meant she had been near it. She pulled him inside by the sleeve and led him directly to the kitchen with the energy of someone presenting evidence. "I made the pasta. Mom helped with the sauce, but the pasta is mine." She pointed at the pot on the stove with the authority of a person claiming a flag. "You have to tell me if it's right. What does right taste like to you?" She thought about it. Like it was made on purpose. He tasted it. Made entirely on purpose. Her face did the thing it did when she was trying not to show how pleased she was, which showed it completely. Margaret was at the counter with a dish towel and a look that he had come to recognize, the one that was surprised every time it shouldn't have been surprised, the look of someone rediscovering something they kept forgetting they were allowed to feel. They ate at the small table, the three of them, and Sophie talked through most of the meal, which was one of the things she had recovered that the 4 silent months had taken the pure pleasure of narrating experience. She talked about the boy from that week's Owen's Light session, who had not spoken for 40 minutes, and then asked if he could make a second bird because he wanted one for his dad, about how Rosa had shown her the trick for getting the chocolate not to have that skin on top, about a book she was reading, where the main character was an island, and she wasn't sure yet if that was possible, but she was reserving judgment. Margaret listened to her with the quality of attention that Daniel had only seen her give to things she was afraid of losing, the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned that ordinary moments are not ordinary. After the dishes were cleared and the kitchen returned to something approaching order, Sophie tugged on Daniel's hand and led him down the short hall to her room. The room had the organized chaos of a child who was creating things faster than she was filing them, drawings pinned to a corkboard and stacked on the desk, the bookshelves overflowing in the specific way of someone who read multiple books simultaneously and put them down open rather than closed. On the wall above her desk, taped directly to the paint, was a drawing. He stopped when he saw it. It was large, covering most of the wall space above the desk, made on several sheets of paper taped together, the seams visible, and the figures on it were drawn in the earnest, proportional freedom of a child who was drawing from feeling rather than from technical training. 4 people. A tall man on the left with dark hair and his hands in his pockets, slightly apart from the others but facing them. Thomas made from memory, his face suggested, rather than rendered, the way you draw someone you're trying to hold on to. Margaret beside him, her hair recognizable, her posture exactly right, the way Sophie saw her mother. Sophie in the center, smaller, holding something that was either a bear or a book, both ears, different sizes, so probably a bear. And Daniel on the right. Beside Daniel, holding his hand, was a small figure with hair that went everywhere and a gap in the drawn smile where a tooth should have been. He stood there for a long time. "I put Owen there," Sophie said from behind his left shoulder, "so he wouldn't feel like he was on the outside of it." The breath left him in a way that had nothing managed about it. 6 years of managed breathing, of learning to regulate the moments when the weight of it became suddenly physical, and this one went straight past all of that. He turned around and crouched down and put his arms around her and held on, and she held back her arms around his neck. The bear still in one hand pressed against his shoulder blade, and he stayed there, because the alternative was not staying, and there was no version of not staying that he was going to choose. "Thank you," he said against her hair. "Sophie, thank you." "You're crying," she observed, not as an accusation, but as a fact requiring acknowledgement. "I know. Is it the good kind?" He pulled back enough to look at her face, her dark hazel eyes, her father's tilt of the head. "It's the kind that means something got put down that I was carrying for a long time." She considered this with the seriousness she gave to things worth being serious about, like when the turtle finally got to stop walking and just float. Exactly like that. She seemed satisfied with this. She took his hand and led him back to the doorway where Margaret was standing, having arrived without announcement, and the 3 of them stood in the entrance to the room with the drawing on the wall visible beyond them, all 4 figures, and the small one with the missing tooth, and nobody said anything for a moment because the moment didn't require it. Margaret's hand found Daniel's shoulder briefly, the same gesture Rosa had used in the break room months ago. The brief, warm pressure of recognition. And then she looked at the drawing and said quietly, "She worked on it for 3 days." 4, Sophie corrected. "The first day I just planned it." He looked at the drawing one more time. Owen's small figure with the gap-toothed smile placed not in the past and not in memory, but in the present picture beside everyone who was still here holding his hand from wherever Owen was, which was not gone entirely, was not lost entirely, was something more like what Daniel had told Sophie on the steps in the dark, present in the going, carried in the continuing, alive in the specific way that love remains alive when the people who hold it choose to keep holding it even after the original source has become something that can only be felt rather than seen. Outside the apartment, the city made its permanent noise, the sirens and the traffic and the voices and the trains under the streets, everything continuing the way everything continued, indifferent and enormous, and somehow, from inside this small kitchen-bright apartment in Brooklyn, entirely bearable.